In 2023, geneticists reported the discovery of 155 new genes in the human genome, tiny segments called microgenes that arose from scratch, from non-coding DNA. West Africans evolved a change in a blood cell protein that grants resistance to malaria about 40,000 years ago. In South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, over 80–90% of high school students are nearsighted, compared to under 25% just 60 years ago. A 2016 study in Nature projected that half the global population may be nearsighted by 2050. Our brains have gotten smaller in the last 10,000 years. Yes, you heard that right. After growing larger for millions of years, the average human brain has shrunk by roughly 10% since the end of the Ice Age. In 2018, a Chinese scientist actually created the first CRISPR-edited human babies, an ethically fraught and widely condemned experiment, an event that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Those babies had a gene altered in an attempt to make them HIV resistant. In the late 19th century, almost no adult had an extra artery in their forearm. Today, roughly 1 in 3 people are born with a median artery running down the center of the forearm. By the end of this century, scientists predict most humans will have this extra artery as a normal part of anatomy. So, are we still evolving? Let's dive in, starting with the surprising evidence that evolution is alive and well under our very skin. Signs of evolution in modern humans. You don't need to dig up fossils to witness human evolution. You can find clues in an anatomy textbook or even on your own body. That median artery is a perfect example. During fetal development, this artery supplies blood to our hands, then usually vanishes as the radial and ulnar arteries take over. But more and more people are keeping this extra vessel into adulthood. In the 1880s, only about 10% of people retained it. By the late 20th century, it was 30%. If the trend continues, a majority of newborns will have an adult median artery by 2100. Researchers call this microevolution in modern humans, a small anatomical change occurring over just a few generations. It's not granting us superpowers, but it is altering our physiology. The extra artery can increase overall blood flow to the hand, potentially useful as a spare in surgeries or if another artery is damaged. It might also come with downsides, like pressing on nerves, possibly causing carpal tunnel issues. But the key point is, our bodies are not static. They're still responding to something. The median artery isn't the only recent change. Wisdom teeth, those third molars that often misalign and require removal, are literally disappearing. Due to changes in our diet and jaw size, 35 to 40% of people today are born without 1 or more wisdom teeth, and this percentage is rising with each generation. In other words, evolution is editing out these unnecessary teeth as our mouths get smaller and our food easier to chew. Similar trends appear elsewhere. A forearm tendon called the palmaris longus, useful for tree-climbing primates, is missing in about 15% of people. The plantaris muscle in the foot, once helpful for grasping with our feet, is absent in about 9% of us. These organs aren't vanishing overnight. They're fading across many generations, a slow cull of parts we no longer use in the modern world. At the same time, some people are gaining new bits of anatomy. There's an additional small bone behind the knee called the fibella that is appearing in more skeletons after having been rare for centuries. The human body, it turns out, is still very much a work in progress. Our genes tell a similar story. In 2023, geneticists reported the discovery of 155 new genes in the human genome, tiny segments called microgenes that arose from scratch from non-coding DNA at some point in our evolution. 2 of these genes are unique to humans and seem to have appeared relatively recently, implying they might have played a role in making us who we are. These microgenes are small, but some are active in our cells. A bunch are linked to growth of tissues and even to certain diseases, suggesting they matter biologically. The fact that scientists are still uncovering new genes in us, including ones that may have emerged after the human lineage began, is striking evidence that evolution has been churning along in our DNA. We didn't just inherit a fixed genetic blueprint from our distant ancestors. New pages have been added to the book. As one evolutionary geneticist put it, if we're right, there's a lot more functionally relevant stuff hidden in the human genome waiting to be understood. Even looking at the past few thousand years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, we see natural selection's fingerprints on our species. When humans invented farming and spread into new environments, our genes responded. For example, Early Europeans and Asians who began raising cattle experienced a genetic sweep, a mutation that let adults digest lactose, the sugar in milk, spread rapidly about 4,500 years ago, turning milk into a lifelong food source. When Stonehenge was built, virtually no adult could digest milk. A few millennia later, many could, a dramatic dietary adaptation. In parts of East Africa, different genetic mutations for lactose tolerance arose independently around the same time, evolution solving the same problem in parallel. In the high plateaus of Tibet, the Andes, and Ethiopia, peoples evolved distinct genetic tricks to thrive in thin mountain air. One Tibetan variant, actually inherited from an archaic human species, the Denisovans, lets them use oxygen efficiently without thickening their blood. West Africans evolved a change in a blood cell protein that grants resistance to malaria about 40,000 years ago. Evolution has been especially busy in the last 10,000 years, after the advent of agriculture. Genes affecting diet, skin color, and immunity show signs of recent natural selection. One geneticist remarked on the incredible adaptability of Homo sapiens, noting that as we colonized every corner of the planet, we're able to make extreme environments our homes. We are like rats or cockroaches, extremely adaptable. Not the most flattering analogy, but you get the point. We're survivors. Crucially, many of these changes didn't require tens of thousands of years. They happened in just a few hundred generations or less. Humans are still evolving, and in some ways evolution might be accelerating. That team studying the median artery concluded that modern humans are evolving at the fastest rate seen in the past 250 years. Fastest rate over that time span is a bit tongue-in-cheek, because 250 years is only about 8 generations. But it underscores that change is measurable even on short timescales. We may not notice it day to day. You don't wake up with a new artery or one less tooth. But over generations, subtle shifts are adding up. The fascinating takeaway is that human biology remains malleable. The evolution story didn't end when we turned sapiens. It's an ongoing saga, and we're in the middle of it. Have we outsmarted natural selection? If evolution is still happening, why do so many people assume it isn't? There's a compelling argument. In the modern world, natural selection, the classic survival of the fittest, has greatly weakened. Charles Darwin's world was harsh. In the 1800s, only about half of British children lived to age 21. Disease, malnutrition, poor medicine, all were ruthless filters. Those with stronger constitutions or advantageous traits were more likely to survive and have kids. But fast forward to today, most babies, in developed countries at least, survive to adulthood. And people with genetic conditions that might have been fatal in childhood now often live full lives thanks to medicine. We vaccinate against measles and polio. We perform C-sections to save babies and mothers who might have died in childbirth. Incidentally, this could be affecting evolution of pelvis size and baby head size. A subtle case of medical anti-selection, allowing traits to persist that nature might have culled. Glasses and surgeries correct poor eyesight. Insulin lets people with type 1 diabetes live and reproduce. Even someone with a fairly severe hereditary disease can often have children of their own with modern care. In short, many of the pressures that used to weed out genes have eased. Some prominent scientists have argued that, as a result, human evolution has all but stopped. Famed naturalist Sir David Attenborough and geneticist Steve Jones have both suggested that in modern societies, we've essentially put natural selection on pause. Evolution is over for humans, at least in the traditional Darwinian sense. The reasoning: almost everyone, regardless of their genetic fitness, has a decent chance to reach adulthood and have children, so the differential reproductive success that drives evolution is minimal. Having a particularly robust immune system or a super athletic body doesn't significantly boost your number of offspring in an era where even the less robust survive and where family size is often a choice unconnected to physical prowess. As one researcher quipped, natural selection isn't giving us bigger brains or better eyesight anymore, because those traits don't strongly affect who has kids in the modern context. It's a compelling point. We've to a large extent outsmarted natural selection. We no longer live red in tooth and claw in nature's trenches. We've built shelters of culture and technology around ourselves. But, and it's a big but, saying natural selection is weaker does not mean evolution has completely stopped. Evolution is not only driven by brutal survival struggles. It can happen through neutral drift, sexual selection, and environment changes in more subtle ways. And importantly, not all populations are equally insulated by technology. Consider disease. In regions without access to expensive treatments, deadly viruses like HIV still impose selection pressures. HIV, for instance, exploded in the late 20th century. Most people without medical access who get HIV/AIDS still die young. Intriguingly, a small percentage of people have genetic resistance to HIV. They might get infected, but progress to AIDS much more slowly or never. And indeed, studies in Africa have found that gene variants that make people frail against HIV, meaning the virus makes them sick faster, are becoming less frequent, presumably because those individuals have fewer surviving children. In other words, HIV is exerting natural selection on the population, favoring genes that confer some resistance. A similar situation happened with malaria over the last few millennia. Malaria was such a scourge that humans evolved multiple defenses, the famous sickle cell trait being one. If you carry one copy of the sickle cell gene, you resist malaria, though 2 copies cause anemia. There are other mutations in genes related to blood or immune function that also give partial malaria resistance, and their frequencies shot up in populations where malaria was rampant. So even as we tamed many diseases, new or persistent ones, like HIV or drug-resistant bacteria, or maybe future pandemics, can still spark evolutionary change. Moreover, survival isn't the only game in town. Reproduction is key, and the modern world hasn't made reproduction equal for all. Think about social sexual selection. Who tends to have more children in today's society? The answers are complex and entangled with culture, but any trait that correlates even loosely with higher reproduction can get selected for. Here's a thought-provoking example: myopia, nearsightedness. In a world of hunters and gatherers, being very nearsighted was a serious liability. You might not survive or find food easily, so any genetic tendency toward myopia was under negative selection. Today, if you need glasses, you get them. Problem solved. In fact, in many developed countries, nearsightedness has skyrocketed because of environmental factors, like lots of reading and screen time. In South Korea, Singapore, and elsewhere, 80–90% of young adults are now nearsighted, up from maybe 20% a few decades ago. Some scientists suspect we're unintentionally selecting for genes that predispose to myopia. How so? Well, people who spend more time in school and indoors have higher rates of myopia, and higher education is often linked with having children later, but also with higher income and sometimes slightly fewer children. However, consider that severe myopia no longer stops you from thriving in a career or finding a partner. In fact, nearsightedness now correlates with academic and economic success in certain societies. There's no stigma, it's seen as normal. So any gene variants that contribute to myopia are no longer being purged. If anything, they might hitch a ride with individuals who are successful in modern knowledge-based economies. Evolutionary biologists have noted that evolution isn't just about survival of the fittest anymore. It's also about what genes are no longer filtered out by survival pressures in a cushy world. Traits that were once disadvantages can become neutral, or even advantages in new environments, allowing them to spread. Another subtle force is sexual selection. Even if we all survive, we don't all attract mates equally. Humans are complicated, and cultural norms play a huge role. But it's conceivable that certain traits, physical or behavioral, that influence attractiveness or family size could be slowly shifting gene frequencies. For instance, if people with a certain temperament or intelligence level pair up and have slightly more children on average, that trait could increase over time. There's also the notion of assortative mating, like tends to marry like in terms of height, IQ, etc., which can concentrate certain gene combinations in subgroups. It's not easy to predict how that plays out, but it means evolution could be happening under the radar, so to speak, via mating patterns. And let's not ignore genetic drift, random change. In large, well-mixed populations, drift is slow, but if parts of the population become isolated, even by accident, their genes can diverge. On Earth today, we're more connected than ever. People from all continents intermarry. Travel is easy, which actually mixes genes and may slow down divergence between human groups. When everyone's meeting everyone, our gene pools tend to homogenize. However, if pockets of isolation do occur, say a small community breaks off, drift and founder effects can lead to noticeable differences over generations. Historically, humans were often isolated by geography, which is why we got such variety in traits. Today's connectivity is in one sense slowing that kind of differentiation. We're arguably blending back into one big family. But on the other hand, the future might introduce new isolation scenarios, which leads us to consider what lies ahead for human evolution. New pressures and hidden trends. Let's pause and absorb a rather startling fact. Our brains have gotten smaller in the last 10,000 years. Yes, you heard that right. After growing larger for millions of years, the average human brain has shrunk by roughly 10% since the end of the Ice Age. Skeletal measurements from across the world show that our cranial capacity peaked with our hunter-gatherer ancestors and then declined in the Holocene epoch, the farming age. Does that mean we're getting dumber? Not necessarily. There are many theories. Maybe our bodies and heads got a bit slighter as the climate warmed and we didn't need brawny builds, though that alone can't explain all the brain reduction. Perhaps brains, which are energy-hungry organs, could afford to get a tad smaller once we developed culture and language. Essentially, outsourcing some mental load to collective intelligence and technology, storing knowledge in writing, for example. But one particularly intriguing hypothesis is that humans underwent a kind of self-domestication. In animal domestication, think dogs from wolves, a suite of traits tends to appear. Tamer temperament, more juvenile-like features, smaller teeth, even smaller brains. Some anthropologists argue that in the last tens of millennia, we did this to ourselves. As we formed larger societies, there was an advantage to being more cooperative and less aggressive. Consider the modern environment. It's full of new chemicals and pollutants that didn't exist a few generations ago. There's early evidence that some people have gene variants that make them a bit more resistant to air pollution's effects on lungs and heart. If pollution unfortunately remains common, those who can better withstand it might have a survival or health edge, nudging their genes forward. Our diets have changed drastically. Could we be evolving to handle high-sugar, high-fat diets? Possibly, though the timeline is short. What about stress and mental health in high-pressure urban settings? That's more complex, but one could imagine resilience traits being valuable. Another pressure, reproductive patterns. In many countries, people are choosing to have children later in life. Biologically, having kids at age 35 or 40 is harder than at 20 to 25. Over time, genes that allow women to remain fertile a bit longer, or that grant longer health span to parents, could be selected for in populations where late parenting is the norm. Also, couples with fertility issues can now use IVF and other assisted reproduction, which is amazing. But it means genes that might have been naturally selected out, because their carriers couldn't have kids, are now passed on thanks to technology. We might be becoming more dependent on medical support for reproduction in the long run, creating an unusual evolutionary loop where our culture, needing careers, delaying kids, and tech IVF together influence which genes get passed on. Through all these examples, one theme emerges. Evolution now is a complex dance between biology and culture. We've changed the rules of the game, but the game goes on. Instead of simple life or death struggles, it's now about subtler equations. Which traits make you thrive in modern society? Or at least don't stop you from thriving. Evolution may not be as brutal as before, but it's still at work. In fact, it may have more pathways to act through than ever, including ones we haven't traditionally considered part of natural evolution. The future. Self-directed evolution and beyond humanity. Up to now, we've talked about largely natural evolutionary changes. But the future of human evolution might look very different, because we are on the verge of taking control of our own evolution. For perhaps the first time in Earth's history, a species, us, is gaining the ability to directly shape its own genetic destiny. Think about what that means. Evolution driven not by environmental pressures or random mutation, but by intentional choices and technologies created by an intelligent species. It's both exciting and a little scary. We're playing with the source code of life. Consider gene editing. Tools like CRISPR now allow scientists to snip and modify genes with unprecedented precision. In 2018, a Chinese scientist actually created the first CRISPR-edited human babies, an ethically fraught and widely condemned experiment, an event that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Those babies had a gene altered in an attempt to make them HIV-resistant. This is likely just the tip of the iceberg. It's becoming conceivable that in a few decades, gene editing could be safe and advanced enough to eliminate hereditary diseases in embryos, or even to introduce enhancements, genes for stronger immunity or higher muscle efficiency. or maybe subtler tweaks like slower aging. If such interventions become mainstream, evolutionary change could occur in one generation by design. We could, for example, decide to edit in adaptations that might have taken millennia to evolve naturally. Need to live on a Mars colony? Perhaps we edit future children for better radiation repair or low oxygen tolerance. In fact, scientists are already testing gene drives in mosquitoes using CRISPR that spread a sterility or anti-malaria gene to nearly 100% of offspring in one go. If we can do that in insects, one day we might do it in humans, essentially forcing a genetic change through an entire population in short order. That's a form of evolution, but on fast forward and guided by us rather than blind selection. Why might we do this? Maybe to adapt to new environments or to improve ourselves. Make ourselves smarter, stronger, more resistant to disease. The motives could be noble, alleviating suffering, or questionable, enhancing some humans and not others. Regardless, it means the question, are we still evolving, could soon be answered with, yes, and we are the ones evolving ourselves. Hand in hand with genetic control is the idea of transhumanism, enhancing humans through technology, not just biology. In a sense, we've been doing this forever. The first hominid who picked up a stone tool or wore an animal hide was augmenting their natural abilities. Today, we routinely extend ourselves with technology. Eyeglasses give sight to the myopic, pacemakers keep hearts beating, prosthetic limbs restore mobility. Many of us effectively function as cyborgs to a small degree. Consider that you probably have a smartphone on you or near you most of the time, an external brain of sorts. As one writer put it, in a literal sense, all of us are transhumans already, because we've extended our natural capabilities with technology. That began with simple inventions like clothing and shelter, and has advanced to things like bionic limbs controlled by thought. Right now, these enhancements aren't genetically passed on. They die with the person or are individual modifications, so they're not biological evolution in the strict sense. But imagine the line blurring further. Brain-computer interfaces that become ubiquitous, effectively changing how our minds work. And perhaps those could influence our biology or at least our behavior in ways that affect reproduction. Or a future where we can grow human organs from someone's cells and implant them, changing their physiology. If we eventually incorporate machinery into our bodies at the DNA level, nanotech that self-replicates, or gene therapies that continually update our tissues, the distinction between natural human and engineered human might fade. What's crucial is that these technologies could dramatically alter the course of evolution. If people start opting for genetic enhancements or cybernetic implants, we might split into divergent paths, those who are heavily enhanced and those who remain unaugmented. It's not hard to envision a future scenario, often explored in science fiction, where there are effectively different subspecies of humans, say Homo sapiens versus Homo augmentus, or even AI-human hybrids. Would they interbreed? Would they want to? Over time, could they become so different that they truly speciate into separate lineages? It's a wild thought, but not impossible. One group might have bodies full of bioengineering tweaks and live vastly longer, while another remains more baseline. The decisions of one generation could lock in heritable changes that set their descendants on unique evolutionary trajectories. And then there is the prospect of leaving Earth. Space, the final frontier, could become an evolutionary crucible. If humans colonize Mars or other planets, the environment there will impose pressures very unlike those on Earth. Low gravity, high radiation, confined living. It's a whole new selective landscape. At first, colonists will rely on technology, spacesuits, domes to survive, but over centuries, might they adapt biologically? If the Mars colony stays in contact with Earth, gene flow continues, big genetic divergence is less likely. But imagine far future scenarios. A ship full of people ventures to another star, becoming genetically isolated for thousands of years. That population could drift and adapt so much that when and if it meets humans from elsewhere again, they've become incompatible, a new species. This wouldn't happen overnight. True speciation might take tens of thousands of years unless deliberately accelerated. Yet it's not far-fetched that distant human colonies could eventually branch off. They might even do so intentionally, editing their offspring to better suit their new world's atmosphere or gravity, thereby accelerating their divergence. Our descendants in 100,000 years on a planet light years away might look at Earth humans as quite alien, and vice versa. Finally, consider a transformative possibility, the end of biological evolution as we know it. This would be the case if humans managed to, say, upload consciousness into machines or achieve digital immortality. If at some point minds no longer need biological bodies, a speculative scenario granted, then Darwinian evolution based on DNA and reproduction would effectively halt, replaced by whatever processes govern machine intelligence evolution, which might be design-based or some other form of self-improvement. That drifts into philosophical territory. Would that still be us evolving, or something entirely new replacing us? In the more near term, even radical life extension could slow evolution. If people live healthy for 150 years and delay having kids much longer, or if population growth halts, the generational turnover that evolution depends on slows down significantly. Evolution loves lots of offspring and turnover. A world of a few long-lived individuals is more static genetically. So paradoxically, success in conquering aging could freeze biological evolution, at least until or unless those near immortals decide to change themselves deliberately. Conclusion: the only constant is change. We set out asking, are we still evolving? By now, the answer should be clear. Yes, in more ways than one. On the one hand, the natural evolutionary forces that shaped us in the past haven't vanished. Our genes and bodies continue to adapt. We grow new arteries, drop old teeth, tweak our metabolisms in response to our environment and lifestyles. On the other hand, we've opened up startling new avenues for evolution, becoming conscious drivers of our own destiny. In the coming centuries, the evolution of Homo sapiens may be driven less by natural selection and more by intelligent selection, our choices to modify biology and integrate with technology. The future human might be a genetically enhanced cyborg living on Mars, a being forged as much by invention as by natural adaptation. This brings both great promise and great peril. We could eliminate diseases that have plagued us for eons, enhance our intelligence and empathy, perhaps even transcend some limitations of our biology. But we could also stumble, creating new problems, ethical dilemmas, inequalities between the modified and unmodified, or even accidentally harmful changes to our gene pool. Evolution used to be blind. Soon it will have our very fallible eyes wide open, hands on the steering wheel. One thing is certain, the story isn't over. Evolution didn't stop when we built smartphones or cities, it only changed form. In fact, it may be more intriguing now than ever. It's not just a slow background process, it's something we'll actively discuss, influence, and witness in real time. We are, in a sense, stepping into the role of nature, becoming the architects of the future human. It's equal parts exhilarating and daunting. Think about the paradox. A product of evolution, us, has become intelligent enough to manage and direct evolution. What would Darwin say? Perhaps he'd be astonished that his greatest show on Earth now has a lead conductor. Or maybe he'd remind us that even when we take the reins, unintended consequences and the laws of nature still apply. We might set things in motion, but control can be illusory. As we conclude this exploration, let's end on a reflective note. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "There is nothing permanent except change." Modern geneticists echo this. The only constant in the universe is change. Our species is no exception. We are still changing, biologically, culturally, technologically. What will we become in 1,000 years, or 10,000, or 1,000,000? Perhaps a unified galactic species with minor tweaks. Perhaps a collection of diverse offshoots, some flesh, some partly silicon, some something else we can't yet imagine. Or perhaps something so transformed that we would hardly recognize it as descending from us. It's a profound thought. Somewhere out there in the far future, humanity might look back on us the way we look at our primitive ancestors. With curiosity, a bit of bewilderment, and maybe the same question we started with. Were they still evolving? The answer will be yes, and their evolution paved the way for us. In the end, whether by nature's hand or our own, we are still evolving, and the future of human evolution is brimming with mystery. We stand at an inflection point where we can observe the process, influence it, and philosophize about it all at once. It's a lot to wrap our heads around, but one thing's for sure, the journey of life goes on, and we are both passengers and increasingly co-pilots on that ride. The question is not if we will change, but how, and what we will choose to become. It's a question that should spark wonder, a healthy dose of caution, and above all, awe at the ever-unfolding adventure of evolution. So are we still evolving? Absolutely. The real question is, what's next?